everyone here tonight to the Voter Identification Amendment Forum. I'm John Brandt, Chair of the Maplewood Human Rights Commission and moderator of tonight's forum. The forum is jointly sponsored by the Human Rights Commissions of the cities of Maplewood and Roseville. In the interest of Minnesota open meeting laws, Human Rights Commissioners from the City of Maplewood are present here this evening, but we will not convene a commission meeting tonight, and no business of the commission will be conducted. I'd like to remind participants that this forum is being broadcast live to the Northeast Metro suburbs on Government Access Cable TV, and to welcome our cable TV viewers. We want to quickly get to our speakers this evening, but first I want to mention a second forum that we will be hosting on the other amendment question that will be on the ballot in November. 2 weeks from tonight, on Tuesday evening, October 23rd, we will be hosting a second forum on the marriage amendment. That event, which we are calling the Future of Marriage in Minnesota, will be held next door at the Maplewood Community Center, where we will have the banquet room with seating for more participants. The format for these two events will be very different. The marriage forum will not be a debate, but rather will feature presenters who will speak to the many issues that affect marriage in Minnesota, including the history and culture of marriage and families, and economic and religious considerations. Is Gary Griffenberg here? We were planning to take a comment from Gary, who is the chair of the Roseville Commission, but I understand that there was a car accident on the way here that he is delayed getting here. So I'll continue on. The Voter ID Forum that we are hosting tonight started out as a community education event, and in the last week has morphed into a debate between some of the leading statewide advocates for the pro and anti sides of this proposed constitutional amendment. With this forum more of a debate than we intended, we would like to establish a tone and some ground rules for this event. When voters go to the polls on November 6th, people will simply vote yes or no on the amendment questions. But the Commission believes that citizens of Minnesota will vote yes or no for many different reasons. These issues are not black and white. The presenters here this evening will be speaking to the many different sides of the proposed amendment. Perhaps many in the audience this evening came with an opinion, but might not have decided how they are going to vote. Undoubtedly, there are many here tonight that have already decided how they're going to vote and are passionate about their opinions. So let's be honest, no one came here tonight not knowing that this issue is controversial, so let's not be surprised when we discover that our neighbors here this evening, who are all deemed to be reasonable people, might see these issues differently. We hope that all participants remember that challenging people to examine different issues and views is seldom accomplished by being overly zealous or simply loud. Informed voters and productive public policy is most likely to come from good information, thoughtful explanations, and perhaps persuasive arguments. The speakers here this evening are skilled presenters and are all worth listening to. We hope the audience is filled with equally considerate and respectful attendees. We are inviting audience participation in our forum this evening. In fact, the questions for our panel tonight will come from you, the audience. To start, each speaker will be given 7 to 8 minutes for their opening comments and to explain some of their views on voter identification. If you have a question for our speakers, we are asking audience members to write the question on a card or on a piece of paper. Maurice will hold cards up. Please ask for a card and we will pass one down the aisle. Or you can write it on a piece of paper and pass it back. We have well over 100 people here tonight, perhaps not, and we will only have time for the panel to perhaps answer 8 to 10 questions. So please submit only your best 1 or 2 questions and trust that others will also ask good questions. Please write only 1 question on a card and indicate on your card whether your question is directed to an individual speaker or to the entire panel. Cards may be passed back to a commissioner who will collect the cards and deliver them to our crack team of 3 commissioners in the back of the room who will review the questions, perhaps combine duplicates, may paraphrase questions, and they will pass them to me as the moderator to read to the panel. By agreement of all parties and to assist with time management, questions will not be taken directly from the audience. There will be 2 rounds of questions. In the first round, questions will be directed to the panel as a whole, and each side will have up to 2 minutes to answer. And opposing speakers will then have 2 minutes to respond. We will rotate questions to each side. The second round will include 1 question directed individually to each speaker in turn, who will then have up to 2 minutes to answer, and the opposing side will have up to 2 minutes to respond. Response time within time limits may be split between the 2 speakers representing each side. Because of the time that can be lost to applause, we are asking audience members not to applaud or otherwise express approval or disapproval to what speakers might say. Panel members are here tonight to educate the audience and will not be directly debating each other. Speakers are welcome to challenge statements made by other panel members, but such responses should be directed at the audience and not to opposition speakers. To facilitate time management, timekeepers are positioned in the front row and will hold up signs to advise speakers when they are down to 1 minute, 30 seconds, and time's up. By agreement on the panel, the presenters will be allowed to go over time, and we'll try to be fair about that. If any speaker believes that they need more time to respond to a question, they may ask for additional time or make notes on the issue and address it during Q&A or during their closing comments. At the end of the forum, each side will be given 5 minutes to summarize their case for why the voter ID amendment is or is not good public policy. So those are the ground rules for the forum tonight. This is a blue ribbon panel of informed speakers that should ensure that this event is both informative and entertaining. I'd like to introduce our panel members in the order that they will be speaking. Please hold applause until all speakers have been introduced. Our first speaker this evening will be Representative Mary Kiffmeyer. Mary Kiffmeyer was the Minnesota Secretary of State from 1998 to 2006. She was elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2008 to House District 16B, which is the area surrounding Big Lake, Minnesota. She was re-elected in 2010 and is now running for a Minnesota Senate seat from the same area. She is the author of the House bill that resulted in the legislation that put this amendment question on the ballot. Our second speaker is Ms. Carolyn Jackson. Carolyn Jackson currently serves as the lobbyist for the ACLU of Minnesota. The ACLU of Minnesota is an affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union, the oldest civil rights law firm in the nation. She has been a lawyer for 20 years, having graduated with honors from the University of Michigan Law School. Her employment experience includes working for Governor Jim Thompson of Illinois and Governor Terry Branstad of Iowa. Our third presenter this evening will be Dan McGrath. Mr. McGrath is the Executive Director of Minnesota Majority and runs the pro-amendment campaign, Protect My Vote. He's been actively promoting the voter ID amendment over the last year, and along with Representative Kiffmeyer, might be considered the leading spokesperson for getting the amendment put into the Minnesota Constitution. Our fourth speaker this evening will be Governor Arne Carlson. Arne Carlson was a Minnesota legislator and Secretary of State in the 1980s and Governor of Minnesota from 1991 to 1999. He was chairman of the board of American Express Funds for 8 years. Governor Carlson believes his #1 accomplishment as governor was restoring integrity to Minnesota's budget process by lifting the state out of an inherited $2.3 billion deficit into a budget surplus by the end of his second term. The Minnesota poll named Governor Carlson, along with Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale, as one of the 3 great Minnesota political figures of the 20th century. Please welcome all of our speakers here this evening. Representative Mary Kiffmeyer is our first speaker this evening. Representative Kiffmeyer, you have 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to the Maplewood City Hall and the residents here for generously sharing of your environment here and your space. Appreciate it very much. Good to see you here this evening, Governor. I haven't seen you in Republican circles for a while, so it's kind of nice to see you again. And Carolyn and Dan as well. And you get to know each other when you're in the process of traveling the state and doing other things like that. And so it is a friendly, as we say, we want to maybe have a disagreement, but not be disagreeable about it. And I appreciate that from the Human Rights Commission and the standards you've set, and for us as well. So I've also been asked to just give a little bit of a background about the photo ID constitutional amendment. As an election judge in my local polling place for about 11 years, my thought about having an ID came while sitting at the table and having folks come up to me who were total strangers, say their name, and my finding that name on the roster. And so even at that time, I thought, well, it would speed things up if we just had a photo ID. Little did I know that later on I would be Secretary of State and be able to work on elections. What a privilege it was to do that. And while I was Secretary of State, to be #1 in voter turnout for all 8 years. So these are things that are dear to my heart, and also the integrity of the election system. The constitutional amendment that's before you today then comes out of that. I think it's important for people to know that. In addition, we did look at a statutory bill. We did pass one in the first year in 2010. But as we saw Governor Dayton's veto of that particular bill, and as we were going through the process at the same time around the country, there were questions about statutory bills and were they constitutional. It's an issue right now in other states. And so I decided that instead of proceeding along the line of a statutory bill, it might be good to start with the Minnesota Constitution, establish that policy there, and proceed to election administration laws derived from the Constitution, like many other laws as well. And so we are here today. It is on the ballot before you as the authority of the Constitution gives it to the legislature by a majority vote of the House and of the Senate, and to place things directly to the people, and as upheld most recently by the state Supreme Court. So we have a constitutional amendment before you, in its essence, is requiring a photo ID as a part of the voting process. Also gives you a free state ID, and it allows a delayed implementation to give the legislature time, if they should choose, prior to its effectiveness for the November election next year. So with that, the photo ID constitutional amendment will add integrity to our election system, and it would also have the necessary flexibility so that it will be easy to vote, continue to do that, but harder to cheat. Same-day registration, absentee voting, voting by mail, military voters, all those methods will continue with the photo ID constitutional amendment. 98% of Minnesotans already have an ID. And in the usual Minnesota style, I think that Democrats and Republicans and independents, plus all our civic organizations, can all work together to help anyone who has need of the free ID. That's a Minnesota style and a Minnesota tradition. But we already have 98% already have one. An ID is a valuable tool. You can hardly function in society today without it. I mean, think of things that you do in your common everyday life, and how frequently you are asked for your ID, to apply for Social Security benefits, to apply for welfare benefits. There's so many ways in life to get a drink, to get a pack of cigarettes, to get on an airplane. Numerous times you go to the bank, get your prescription drugs, to vote in a union election, to get into the Democratic National Convention, to get into a federal building. Constantly, the use of an ID is an important tool in common everyday society. In this constitutional amendment, the required cost is a free state ID. In the statutory bill, we allowed $1 million to $1.5 million in regards to providing that free state ID. It would also, and I believe, should include voter education funding as well. That's been an important component, something I believe strongly in. And by all working together, we can help spread those dollars around to make sure that we may increase voter turnout through this additional effort. There are no technology mandate costs to local government in the photo ID constitutional amendment. There aren't any technology mandates to local government in this constitutional amendment. In the language that would go into the Constitution, it also talks about provisional ballots. They're used in 43 other states. In Minnesota, this would expand the ability of the voter to cast a ballot that does not exist today. In Indiana, a similar-sized state to Minnesota, there were less than one provisional ballot per precinct if you take those numbers from Indiana to Minnesota. In photo ID states, all the studies, and I assure you, there have been many of them, voter turnout has increased or stayed the same. Matter of fact, it's increased amongst Democrat areas more than Republican areas. And yes, some have said, well then, why do you support it? Because my motive and my mission is about the integrity of the election system. And through that process, I believe we can also increase voter turnout. Not only that, there's not been one single court case that has found voter disenfranchisement. Not one. And there have been many. For some issues, some folks would say, well, there's no problem. That's kind of one of those, I don't see any problem. Have you looked? Other organizations have and have found those problems. Matter of fact, in regards to the last presidential election, there's still 6,224 voters who cast a ballot, and they were counted, and we still cannot find them. There are issues and there are problems. But I also have heard the comments from some that talk about our system is just fine, especially in the context of the recount that was done in the Coleman-Franken campaign. I want to mention that according to Minnesota state law, when you have a recount, you can't look at the first part of the process of the election system. You are required by state law in a recount to only look at the end of the system. So counting the ballots accurately or recounting them doesn't address the issue of should the ballots, some of them, even have been in the ballot box to begin with. That's really the fundamental issue here. And the focus of photo ID is on the beginning of the election system, the part of registration, the part of eligible voters, all eligible voters being able to cast their ballot, expanding that even with provisional ballots, and making sure that it is only eligible voters who are making the decisions that govern trillions of dollars and much power in our country. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Representative Kiffmeyer. Our next speaker is Ms. Carolyn Jackson.
Good evening. Thank you, John, and thank you to the cities of Maplewood and Roseville for hosting this tonight, because we've been trying to teach people what they're actually going to be voting on this fall. It seems to make sense. You do use an ID for almost everything, cashing a check, for buying beer. I'm always pulling my ID out for anything. But this is much more than a voter ID amendment. It is a radical overhaul of our election system in the state of Minnesota. Raise your hand if you know what a provisional ballot is. Okay, I hope that all of you are signed up to be election judges, because we're going to need your expertise coming up in the future, because there are going to be 500,000 provisional ballots, and we're going to need people who understand them and know how to work with them. This will be the only state in the country that will have both election day registration and provisional ballots. Nobody else does this. Election day registration actually provides greater protection for voters than provisional ballots do. Provisional ballots were created if you weren't allowed, if your name had been accidentally dropped from the roster, then you could vote a provisional ballot and they could go back and fix it later. In Minnesota, if your name's been accidentally dropped, you can register right there in the election. But nobody else in the whole country has had to do both, administer election day registration and provisional ballots. We don't know how that's going to work. So raise your hand if you know what substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification means. No, nobody knows, because that's brand new language. No, nobody knows, because it doesn't exist anywhere in the United States. It doesn't exist in other states' election laws, and it doesn't exist in Minnesota's election laws. But we're going to write that into our Constitution. And do you know what happens when you write language into the Minnesota Constitution that nobody knows what it means? Lawsuits. Lots and lots of lawsuits. I like to think of this as the Full Employment for Lawyers Amendment, because nobody knows what it means, and when there's stuff in the Constitution that nobody knows what it means, that means there are going to be lawsuits. And speaking of lawsuits, Representative Kiffmeyer mentioned the states around the country have had some lawsuits on voter ID. And there have been people who have come forward who can't vote. In Pennsylvania, there have been a series of lawsuits, and the final standard was whether the state could prove that no one would be disenfranchised, and they couldn't prove that, so they stopped the voter ID law there. Advocates have called around, and they've called a few thousand people and already identified 300 people who lack the ID to vote and wouldn't be able to vote under that law. So there are people who are impacted by this. So I talked about lawsuits. Who's going to be bringing these lawsuits? Voters who are impacted by this constitutional amendment. The legal standard is whether it's an undue burden on this fundamental right. So let's talk about some of the voters. We'll pull a rural voter from Crane Lake, Minnesota, which is up in St. Louis County. Let's say he went out canoeing a couple days before the election and his canoe capsized and he lost his wallet, so he doesn't have his driver's license. He comes to the polling place to vote, and he goes to cast his ballot, and the election judge says, no, you don't have an ID, you can't vote. So you have to go over to the provisional ballot table. There at the provisional ballot table, you get a ballot and you fill it out. And then you fold it up and put it in an envelope and give it to the election judge. It is neither cast nor counted. It'll go into a box. At the end of the night, the election judge will take that box of the provisional ballots and ship it down to Duluth, which is the county seat. So in the next couple of days, probably 3 to 5 days, the voter will have to go get a new ID, and then he'll go 135 miles down to Duluth, have his ballot verified, and drive 135 miles back home. Is that an undue burden on his constitutional right to vote? The second voter, let's talk about a deployed military voter. Right now, it's very difficult for our soldiers serving overseas to vote. They have to order an absentee ballot, fill out their ballot, and then mail it. And when you're in a combat zone, the simple act of mailing a letter is a very difficult thing to do. Right now, we allow them to do what's called self-certify. And that is, they say, I am who I say I am. And I say, I'm happy with that. You're putting your life on your line for the country, so thank you very much, and you can vote that way. That's fantastic with me. And they ship the ballot back and it gets counted. Now, in this constitutional amendment, it says all voters will be subject to substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification. So no matter how it gets implemented, there will be one more bureaucratic step for that soldier to go through to vote. Is that an undue burden on their constitutional right to vote? The courts will find out. Finally, I'd like to talk about elderly voters. And I think of 2 women that I know here in Minnesota who this would affect. The first is a woman that I met at a forum. And she had lived in Arizona and Nevada. And she moved to Minnesota to spend her golden years with her daughter. And so her Nevada driver's license expired. She had to get a Minnesota driver's license. So she got her birth certificate. She got her first marriage license and her first divorce decree. She got her second marriage license and her second divorce decree, and she went down to the DVS to apply for a driver's license. They denied it to her. So she went back and forth and back and forth. It took her several months and almost $1,000, and finally she was able to get a Minnesota ID card. Is that an undue burden on her right to vote? The other woman is an elderly African-American woman. And I am the same age as the civil rights laws in the United States. So African Americans from a certain part of this country who are older than me very likely do not have a birth certificate. When it came time for their mothers to give birth, they were not allowed in the hospital. They didn't get a birth certificate. Their birth would have been recorded in a family Bible, or perhaps they got a baptismal certificate. But that's not good enough for the state of Minnesota. This voter is one of those women. She's older than I am. She's African American. She was born in one of those areas of the country. She does not have a birth certificate. She applied for a Minnesota ID card, and she was denied. She applied then for a variance, and she was denied. She does not have a Minnesota ID card, and she's not likely to get one. So now these are women who had people to help them, and they had some resources. Imagine someone who has been rushed to the nursing home because they've fallen and broken their hip. How are they going to go through this bureaucratic nightmare in order to vote? Is that an undue burden on their constitutional right to vote? Now, we'll hear, oh, the enabling legislation, that'll help. No, enabling legislation cannot fix what the Constitution makes wrong. The Constitution can't be trumped by enabling legislation. So we can't go back and add protections later. This would be the strictest in the nation. Every other state that has passed a law of this kind has put exceptions into their law. Even Mississippi, which is the only state that has looked at this as a constitutional amendment, they all had exceptions. One last thing I want to mention that will be a cause of lawsuits is the effective date, July 1st, 2013. All of this is going to have to be put in place by July 2013. The legislature is going to have to go back and forth with the governor and get the law enacted. And if they don't, what's going to happen with the elections that November? If there's no enabling legislation and somebody loses, guess what? They're going to sue. They're going to say this election is invalid. This constitutional amendment is complicated. It is a radical overhaul. We don't know how it's going to work. And the best thing you can do is send it back to the legislature with a no vote in November. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Jackson. Our next speaker is Mr. Dan McGrath. Dan.
Thank you. With the exception of several of the United States, every industrialized nation on earth requires identification to vote. It's such a common sense, obvious thing that pretty much the whole world agrees with it. Now, about provisional ballots, this notion that all election day registrants, 500,000 in 2008, would be required to cast provisional ballots is not supported by what is actually in the amendment. The amendment requires provisional ballots be provided to people who don't have identification on election day. Even if every single person in the state of Minnesota who currently doesn't have identification failed to get free government-issued identification before the upcoming election after this takes effect, there would be 84,000 maximum. That's if no one was capable of getting a free identification card before the election. Those are the only people that would be required to cast a provisional ballot under this amendment. The language makes it very clear. This eligibility verification step has nothing to do with provisional ballots. It doesn't apply to that part of the constitutional amendment. Now, we use photo ID to protect our financial assets at the bank. But how much more is our ballot worth than our checking balance? Our votes control billions of dollars at the state level and trillions of dollars at the federal level and unfathomable amounts of political power. Are we to believe that no one would be tempted to steal something of that value? Now, another process that we use in banking, besides just showing our identification when we make a withdrawal, is something that is substantially equivalent to that. When you go to an ATM, the substantial equivalent of showing identification at the counter is using your ATM card and punching in a PIN number. The bank considers that substantially equivalent and it's good enough for you to withdraw your money. When you make an online transaction with your debit card, you provide the card number and a security code from the back of the card and expiration date. Provisional or absentee ballots, mail-in ballots can be certified by a substantially equivalent process, just like we use for common banking transactions. So substantially equivalent is really not that mystifying. The banks do it. We can do it for voting. I'm going to give you a little history about how voter ID laws began to come about in the United States. After the contentious 2000 election, presidential election, that involved countless recounts, Florida debacle, Canadian Chaz, Ohio, lawsuits, former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker formed a commission to investigate how we could improve our nation's election processes. They released a report on their findings in 2005, and a key recommendation of that Carter-Baker report was to require photo ID and make identification available at no charge. The Carter-Baker report concluded, quote, "The electoral system cannot inspire public confidence if no safeguards exist to deter or detect fraud or to confirm the identity of voters." Subsequently, Indiana put the Carter-Baker recommendations into action in 2005. The ACLU, the NAACP, promptly sued to block implementation, claiming the voter ID bill would disenfranchise voters. They were rebuffed in court 3 times. 2 lower courts found no evidence to support the ACLU's claims of disenfranchisement, and finally they appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and Indiana's voter ID law was again upheld. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Stevens wrote the majority opinion in the case that was known as Crawford v. Marion, upholding Indiana's voter ID law. He said, quote, "The inconvenience of going to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles gathering required documents, and posing for a photograph does not qualify as a substantial burden on most voters' right to vote or represent a significant increase over the usual burdens of voting. The severity of the somewhat heavier burden that may be placed on a limited number of persons, such as elderly persons born out of state who may have difficulty obtaining a birth certificate, is mitigated by the fact that eligible voters without photo identification may cast provisional ballots that will be counted if they execute the required affidavit at the circuit court clerk's office. Stevens also referred to Indiana's voter ID law specifically as non-discriminatory. Minnesota's voter ID amendment is based on the opinion of the United States Supreme Court, incorporated in the three principles discussed in the opinion. First and most obvious, it requires in-person voters to show photo ID. It requires the state to provide photo identification at no charge, and it establishes what the court referred to as a fail-safe ballot, commonly known as a provisional ballot. They're used successfully, as Representative Kiffmeyer said, in 43 other states. When a League of Women Voters, the NAAC, and Common Cause sued the state of Georgia to stop a new voter ID law based on claims of disenfranchisement, the judge there upheld the Georgia law. In his ruling, he said the plaintiff's failure, despite their efforts to uncover anyone who can attest to the fact that he or she will be prevented from voting, provides significant support for the conclusion that the photo ID requirement does not unduly burden the right to vote. Claims that a voter ID requirement will lead to disenfranchisement have been rejected by the courts, including the highest court in the land. The objective evidence and the findings of the courts of law is that voter ID does not burden the right to vote. The disenfranchisement claims of opponents of voter ID are unsubstantiated. They also like to claim that voter ID is a solution in search of a problem. They say that voter fraud is not a problem in Minnesota or the nation. Once again, though, the objective evidence and the finding of courts of law completely refute that notion. Minnesota currently leads the nation in convictions for voter fraud. Following the 2008 election, 200 individuals were convicted, a record for the state and the highest number of convictions from a single election in any state since 1936. In addition, 23,000 election day registrants were flagged to be challenged because they provided names or addresses that didn't check out. After accounting for people who moved, shortly after voting, 6,224 election day registrants from 2008 remain flagged for challenge right now on the official voter rolls. The U.S. Supreme Court noted that the United States has a long history of voter fraud that has been well documented by respected journalists and historians. Voter fraud has been proven in courts time and again. Disenfranchisement as a result of voter ID, however, has been disproven in the courts. The objective evidence is conclusive. The verifiable facts are irrefutable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGrath. Our final speaker this evening will be Governor Arne Carlson. Governor Carlson.
Well, thank you very much. After hearing the other side talk about how magnificent this amendment is and how it will impose such a small, tiny burden on all of us, I'm almost tempted to come forward and say I support it. The problem is, it kind of reminds me of a story my father once told. He was a Swedish immigrant, and we were out of the Bronx of New York, and he was frankly a very good joke teller. And during the Depression, there were a lot of schemes in New York on how to make money pretty quickly. And he told the story of this hot dog vendor who worked out of Central Park, New York, and he would take the bun of the hot dog, and then he would stick his finger. He had a nice rubber finger, you know, the banker's rubber that they use to count bills. He would stick it into the bun, plaster with mustard and relish. The guy would reach to grab it, and then look around for where his hot dog was. And that's kind of what we're going through here tonight. I wouldn't be here if what these people said was accurate. No way at all. The reason I'm here is for several things. One is amending the Constitution of the state of Minnesota is immensely important. This is here because a bill passed on a totally partisan vote in the House and Senate. Totally partisan vote in the House and the Senate, and was vetoed by the governor. Now, fortunately, Democrat, Republican, and independent governors throughout the history of the state of Minnesota have vetoed partisan bills. The most recent example was 2010 on a voter improvement law relative to felons voting, which is where the problem that they describe so eloquently really exists. It was vetoed by Governor Plenty, and it was vetoed because the Democrats were for it and the Republicans were against it, including Mrs. Kiffmeyer. And he said in his veto message, it did not pass on a bipartisan basis. It is not a bipartisan bill. He is exactly correct. I fully subscribe to that. We don't want a political system in Minnesota where one party takes over both houses and passes an endless array of bills designed to create mischief and give them a political edge in elections. Today it's the Republicans. What happens when tomorrow it's the Democrats? They'll be here screaming and hollering with the exact opposite arguments. Any amendment that comes to the Constitution should come about as a result, one, of a study. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? Two, what language can we put on the amendment that will resolve that problem and allow the voters to fully understand it? And thirdly, what are the costs? What we have here, as I thought Carolyn Jackson so aptly put it, vague language, substantially equivalent. Lawyers love that. At $400 an hour, they're going to be arguing in our court system, making tons of dough, pro and con, on what that language means. Now, these people maybe feel comfortable with what it means, but there are people over there who don't. And those disagreements can only, in a constitutional amendment, be resolved in a court of law. Notice also how there's absolutely no talk whatsoever about the budgetary impact. Mary Kiffmeyer says, well, it cost over $1 million for voter ID, and that's really about it. In the email that she sent me, she basically says there's really no local government costs. And then go, unless, of course, the state mandates that. Well, how do you conduct a statewide election without state mandates? Absolutely impossible. Let's take a look at what this is going to actually cost all of us as a taxpayer. It's going to cost well over $100 million. 87 county auditors have been asked, what will the cost be in your county? When you add up all the local government costs, it will be over $60 million. The high estimate is $74 million. Now that's going to go on top of property taxes. Over the past 10 years, we have seen the highest property tax increases in the state of Minnesota. Now we're going to add on to local government a mandate that's going to cost them somewhere north of $60 million. Then you look at the state costs. The state, when they convene in January, will have a budget deficit of approximately $4.4 billion. And on top of that, they're going to add another $10 to $15 million of costs on this. And if they decide to pick up the local government costs, they're going to have a lot more. We're talking cutting somebody else's part of the budget to make an accommodation for this amendment. And the individual costs, which Carolyn, I thought, covered very, very well, are estimated. And this, by the way, is a study that's done by Hamline University professor David Schultz, who's one of the most respected political scientists in Minnesota, and the group that he has put together. And he put out an excellent report. Now, for those of you that are inclined to debunk these, as I see a gentleman here doing, I would ask this. It's incumbent upon the proponents to come together with their budget. They did not do it in the legislature, and they have not done it since. I'm going to pass out Mary Kiffmeyer's email, and you can contrast for yourself. a cost of about $2.8 million, or a cost of well over $100 million. And those are serious costs. And let me tell you what the legislature will say if this amendment were to pass, and the cost will transfer. They're going to say, oh, the people forced it on us. You can guarantee one thing. The legislature will not suspend its pay for a year to pay for this. They will not take responsibility for the mischief that they have created. Nor will they take responsibility. The Star Tribune, I think, reports something like 215,000 people whose votes will be placed in jeopardy. They will not take responsibility for that either. So it's up to you and me to send it back to the legislature, tell them to form a bipartisan commission, make it professional, have public input, Democrat, Republican, independent, tall, small, short, fat, whatever. Everybody have part of the process so that all of us as Minnesotans can feel comfortable in having an election process continue that we're deeply proud of. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Well, we'll move to our first set of questions, and these questions will be directed to the panel. The first question will be answered by the pro side, and Mr. McGrath and Representative Kiffmeyer will have 2 minutes to respond, and then we will provide an opportunity for the other side to respond. The first question, and both sides have already touched on this. What is the expected cost to the Minnesota taxpayer of implementing voter ID process if it passes?
Thank you, Mr. Brandt. Appreciate that question. The expected cost that is required by the Minnesota Constitutional Amendment on photo ID is the free state ID. That is the expected cost. I would also expect, and as we supported in the statutory bill, that there would also be money spent in regards to voter education. That is a good thing. And for people who do not already have a state ID or a free ID like that, it is important to realize they're getting a significant benefit from this constitutional amendment. A tool such as a photo ID that Andrew Young, former African-American mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, said at the National Association of Secretaries of State meeting that it was a disenfranchisement to not require it. He felt that strongly about it. And so I think we have good standing with Jimmy Carter, Andrew Young, many others as well, that are supporting the photo ID requirement. But the cost is the free state ID, voter education, and those are the two essences that are in the constitutional amendment. Some of these other gargantuan amounts thrown out are unsubstantiated, and their foundation is questionable. They are based upon numbers, such as Mr. McGrath pointed out, that start from an assumption that is so huge and so out of line with common basic understanding of how you are able to have an ID. And so when you start with assumptions that are fundamentally flawed, the conclusion will be flawed as well. Thank you.
If I could just add to that real quick. The local governments are not expected or demanded to incur any costs under this voter ID amendment. When people talk about these huge local government costs, you have to ask them, what are they going to spend the money on? And where in this constitutional amendment does it say that they have to spend that money?
All right, I'm going to read you the constitutional amendment, first of all. I'm going to probably say this in every one of my answers. All voters voting in person must present valid government-issued photo identification before receiving ballot. The state must issue photographic identification at no charge to an eligible voter who does not have a form of identification meeting the requirements of these sections. A voter unable to present government-issued photo identification must be permitted to submit a provisional ballot. That's every precinct has to have a provisional ballot station. That costs money. A provisional ballot must only be counted if the voter certifies the provisional ballot in the manner provided by law. All voters, including those not voting in person, must be subject to substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification prior to a ballot being cast or counted. That means when you register on election day, you have to be Your eligibility has to be proven before your vote is cast or counted, and that's a cost on your local government issuer. So, Governor, you want to talk about the cost some?
Yeah, I think we have to be very careful when people present to us an item that we know intuitively costs money, and they tell us it really doesn't cost us any money. This is kind of like going to a car lot and buying a car, and you ask a question, well, how does it work and what kind of mileage does it get? And you say, well, we don't really know yet, but it really works well. And we want you to take our word for it. All right, I'll do that. What does it cost? Oh, well, we can't tell you that, but after you buy it, we'll mail you the bill. I think we're entitled not to have their criticism of a budget that was put together by experts at Hamline University. I think we're entitled to see their budget. They're the ones that have proposed this. They're the ones that took this through 2 houses of the Minnesota legislature without once presenting a budget, not even requiring a fiscal note. And then we wonder why we haven't balanced our budget with massive shifts, massive borrowings in 10 years. And why we're going into the next session with a $4.4 billion deficit. If what they say is accurate, then we have 87 county auditors that really don't know their business. And I'll tell you, I was state auditor, not state treasurer. And one of the things, or Secretary of State, whatever I was, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure it's a promotion or a demotion. But one of the things I learned in the audit process of local government is how extraordinarily well overall local government works. And I say that most sincerely. And the higher up we go, the less efficient and the less cost effective we are. And the one thing I know about county auditors is they know their business. And I'll give you, I was on the radio show this morning and I got a call in, and let me just read you the number. I thought it was kind of interesting. Cass County estimated that the cost per ballot would be about $150. Instantly, another gentleman got on the line and said, I'm up here in Kitson and we're estimating it's going to cost $250 a ballot. I'm very tempted to send the bill to these people. But really, these are serious costs, and people are very, very deeply concerned because most governmental entities are frankly broke and having a difficult time balancing their budgets.
Okay, thank you, Governor. Next question for the panel, and this will be presented first to the anti-side, to vote no people. If the voter identification amendment passes, how will it affect absentee voting, and what are the problems with provisional ballots?
All right, that's 2 questions, so that's okay. With absentee voting, all voters must be subject to substantially equivalent identity verification. Now, I did a legal search this afternoon on substantially equivalent. I thought there has to be something out there. The only thing I could find was in regards to patent law. So that if Bayer makes aspirin that's marked Bayer, and Johnson & Johnson makes aspirin that's marked the J, those are substantially equivalent. That's the only sort of thing. It has nothing to do with voting law. We don't know what substantially equivalent means. How can you coming up and presenting an ID to an election judge be anything like presenting a voter ID to your mom who's going to certify her absentee ballot, or for soldiers who self-certify? Nobody knows how that's going to work. This is brand new language, and it's really strange. As far as the provisional ballot goes, there are 2 ways that provisional ballot is going to work. The first is what we talked about with the ID. You don't have an ID, you go cast a provisional ballot. And that would be a separate area in a polling place. So places that have tight precincts right now, they'll have to get another room for the provisional ballot table, hire more election judges, train those election judges on how to do it. Then they'll have to process the provisional ballots. How do you secure them? How do you get them? Do you take them back to the city clerk's office? Do you take them to the county's office? How are they counted? How is your secrecy of your ballot protected? If you're only one in the county and they verify your ballot and it goes up by 1, everybody's going to know how you voted, right? And then with election day registration, and hopefully someone's going to ask a question about election day registration, provisional ballots may come into play there. And that's an entirely different question altogether. But that's basically, provisional ballot is one more station at the precinct, and they're not counted at the time of the election.
Okay, and a vote no response. I'm sorry, vote yes response.
Okay, how are absentee and provisional ballots, how are absentee ballots affected and what are provisional ballots? Absentee voting will not be affected in any noticeable way to the overwhelming majority of people that use them. Absentee ballots on the signature envelope currently require that you record your identification number on the signature envelope. Underneath that space, there's a little checkbox. It says, I don't have any ID. The checkbox will go away. You'll have to get an ID number to record on your signature envelope. And as I described earlier, that is substantially equivalent. It's good enough for the banks. It's good enough to guard our money. It should be good enough to guard our ballots. Provisional ballots in Indiana. In 2008, high voter turnout election, they had 4,000 provisional ballots cast statewide. Superimpose that on Minnesota's 4,103 voting precincts. We're talking about an average of less than one provisional ballot per precinct. And now we're talking about building a room, hiring 2 election judges to babysit an average of less than one provisional ballot per precinct. Provisional ballots are a fail-safe ballot, as the Supreme Court has called it. They're used in 43 other states. It's not some apocalyptic plot. It's a simple mechanism to make sure that no one is ever turned away from the polling place without a chance to vote. Our current election system sometimes turns people away without a chance to vote. If they can't find someone to vouch for them, they don't have a utility bill in their name, they don't get to vote. They're turned away, disenfranchised. The provisional ballot will ensure that that never happens.
You know, if I may, I'm beginning to learn more about Indiana than I ever wanted to know. I honestly came here tonight thinking that we were going to discuss an amendment to the Minnesota Constitution. And I thought it would be helpful if the proponents would come in with a study that said this is what it does, this is why we need it, these are the violations that have occurred, and here are the costs. And they come in telling us all about Georgia, all about other states, but virtually nothing about Minnesota. The photo voter ID should be called, or the violation should be called, voter impersonation. They keep referring to voter fraud. That bill was brought up in 2010, and Mary Kiffmeyer voted against it. Now, she may have had good reasons, but then for heaven's sakes, at least amend it and correct the problem with felons voting. That is the problem they keep pretending is the problem of voter impersonation. I don't think they can name one case of voter impersonation. When Mike Freeman, the county attorney of Hennepin County, went through all the various violations, he came up with one. It was a felon, and he came up with no voter impersonation. Nationally, NYU issued a report, and their report essentially said over a 10-year period from 2000 to 2010, they surveyed, I think it was something like 649 million votes were cast. And over that period, they found 13 cases of voter impersonation and over 400 people who died as a result of being struck by lightning. Now, those are the facts. But as it pertains to Minnesota, I'm not aware that voter impersonation has been a problem. Think of it, first of all, they pretend like we have no voter ID process today when you go to vote. We do. It works out extraordinarily well. And it even involves the postal system. It verifies his address and who you are. But here we have the photo ID, and I think Carolyn has laid out very well how hard it's going to be. When 2 boards in Coochiching County got together and discussed the impact on nursing homes, my numbers are roughly right. Out of 24 residents in one home, only 1 had the proper identification that would meet the test of this constitutional amendment. 23 did not. In the other one, it was something like 7 had the proper identification out of 54 that lived there. Elderly people are in panic about this. Students are in panic. Students that go to St. Cloud State and live in Rochester have to go back to Rochester to vote. Don't tell me that's not an impediment. How many of us here would drive 130, 150 miles to vote?
Governor, can I interrupt you, please?
Yes.
Thank you. We're getting out of balance somewhat, and I'd like to offer some additional time.
Surely, no problem at all.
To the pro side.
You know, Governor, I'm kind of thinking maybe you were Secretary of State from the way you're talking there. You know, I have appreciated in the past, Governor, when you have spoken, and I've spoken highly of you for the knowledge that you have. But also for myself, the realization that when we did the statutory bill that we had no budget, of course we had a budget. Not only that, we had a fiscal note. I'm not quite sure when you're kind of mixing up some of the big budget or the particular one, but for the photo ID statutory bill, we did get a fiscal note through the Secretary of State office. But in the beginning of the process, it was a bigger price tag. By the time we had the final statutory bill, it was a total of $3.5 million. And $1 million was for a software development. So the $2.5 million was for the free ID and for voter education. That is what the legislature voted on. And I think it's important to just recognize that. We did have that. The Center for the American Experiment, a nonpartisan group, has done a study. They found that there is savings accrued to the election system. It isn't just a matter of provisional ballots, which, by the way, the same kind of ballot envelope that is used for voting an absentee ballot can be used for a provisional ballot as well. People are familiar with that. That's not a totally strange thing. My big thing, though, is that voter impersonation, if you're an election judge and a stranger is standing in front of you and doesn't have their ID, how do you know they are who they say they are? How do you know? And you don't. You could have voter impersonation happening right in front of you, but without a photo ID requirement, you'd be missing it. And so this whole nonsense of saying I have to come up with this when I'm denied the tool that would help make sure you are who you say you are is just amazing logic, or illogic, as I would like to call it. And so it is important who you are, showing your ID, all of us working together to make sure that they have that ID. That is not an insurmountable, gargantuan problem as you might have it be portrayed here. It is not. Many of those same seniors were told when they came into a nursing home or assisted living, give up your ID, you don't need it. So we can remedy that. As they come, we can help them, just like they do in many other ways when you come into those facilities. My sister came into the group home. First thing she needed was a state ID. This is not an insurmountable. It is fairly obvious and fairly appropriate that we accomplish this, and it will be cost effective as well.
I can name 3 people who can't vote. Ruth L. Frank, Dorothy Cooper, and Evelyn Collier, because they can't get a state-issued ID. I have not heard the proponents name one person who lost their vote because of voter impersonation. This is not a problem. It doesn't exist. There was a fiscal note with House Bill 210, Representative Kiffmeyer's bill that was vetoed. It did not cover all the costs. Indiana had a fiscal note. They estimated $700,000 to provide the free IDs. It ended up costing $10 million. Georgia had education. They ended up spending about $5 to $6 million educating voters. And in fact, the federal court barred voter ID from going into place until voters knew what was happening. And so this is a very expensive undertaking. And one of the reasons that Indiana is interesting is that they have about the same number of voters as we do. Their state has more than 1 million people than ours does. Their voter turnout is about 39%. But they have about the same number of voters as Minnesota. Our voter turnout is 78%. So it is really apples to oranges, but as far as costs go, when they have about the same number of voters, it costs them $10 million only to provide the free IDs.
Okay, Mr. McGrath, you can have the last word.
I'm good.
Okay. The next question is actually related to some of the issues that we were just discussing. So I think there's a good segue here. What evidence is there that states that have voter photo ID requirements have reduced voter fraud, and what is the experience in other states that have enacted this legislation or amendment? And this question starts on the pro side.
Well, voter fraud is something that has been well documented throughout the nation. It's a common sense thing that requiring identification is going to reduce voter fraud that involves using false identity or even voting while ineligible, thinking that you can get away with just saying, well, it wasn't me. A signature on the line is insufficient. An oath is insufficient. We wouldn't accept vouching, for example, to make a financial transaction. But we do allow right now in Minnesota the creation of entirely fictitious identities out of whole cloth on the spot in the polling place through the process of election day registration and vouching. The voter ID amendment would clearly put a stop to that hole in the process and probably eliminate it entirely. The voter ID amendment will still permit some residence establishment under the statutory process, but everyone will have to show ID. So the 6,000 some people that we currently don't know who they are, where they are, that are flagged for challenge on the voter rolls right now, would no longer be a problem. We wouldn't know who they are, we wouldn't know where they live, and would have confidence that fraud isn't occurring. I'm not sure what the statistics are in other states of how much fraud has been suppressed by voter identification.
Okay. We hear these numbers tossed from the 6,000 number. That's not verified anywhere. The only number that really makes any difference is the number of convictions. And these numbers get tossed around, and they've been debunked over and over and over again by the Secretary of State's office. They're nonsense. This just makes no sense. As far as studies go for reduction of voter fraud, there's nothing like that out there. There's no study from Indiana. There's no study from Georgia looking at voter fraud at all. The studies have all gone around the impact on people who are affected by this, and they're preliminary. I haven't read any final studies. The most interesting one was a study that was proposed, and this is just trivia, we're here to educate, a study looking at who cast the provisional ballots and why they cast a provisional ballot and whether they went back and had their ID checked. And that study has not been finalized, so I don't have the result of it. But it'll be interesting to know, to see how this voter ID actually affects voters who go to the trouble of casting a provisional ballot. But there's no study been done in Minnesota that will show that this reduces anything. There's no study done in Indiana or Georgia. It's just a political tool.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Amendments to the U.S. and Minnesota constitutions have generally been enacted to protect or extend citizen rights, not limit them. Why should this provision be in the Constitution and not in legislation? And the no side has an opportunity to go first.
Well, obviously, we don't think it should be in the Constitution. The history of voting in this country has been an expansion of voting rights. When it was first founded, the only people who could vote were white men who held property. And then the property requirement was dropped. And then the 15th Amendment was passed, and the franchise was extended to all men. And then the 19th Amendment was passed, and the franchise was extended to women. In 1964, the 24th Amendment was passed, which outlawed the poll tax. Around that same time, the Voting Rights Act was passed to make the promise of the 15th Amendment real, so that all qualified voters could vote, and to ensure that there were no Jim Crow laws. And then in 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed to extend the franchise to voters who are 18 years and older. It's been a history of expanding. Here in Minnesota, we instituted Election Day registration in 1974, and the result of that has been the highest turnout in the country. We've had the highest turnout in the country for as long back. I've only looked at the numbers for the last 10 years, but I think since 1974 we have led the nation in voter turnout. I don't see why we would want to limit people's ability to vote.
Okay, thank you. And from the pro side?
Well, there is no question that in our Minnesota State Constitution, we have Article 7, which is about elections. From that, there have been derived 12 chapters of election law. So the founders, in regards to the original document of the Constitution, started with a portion of the Constitution addressing elections. From that, 12 chapters of election law. They work together. But in this case, since in other states there were questions about its constitutionality in the most recent efforts for statutory bills, it seemed appropriate. I mean, how more bipartisan can you get than to put this constitutional amendment on the ballot for all of the people, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Green, and every political party, to have their say. You can't get more bipartisan than the voters themselves considering this question and having this wonderful conversation about a constitutional amendment that is constructive and positive for society as a whole. This is your election. Election day is really when the people govern. It's the day when you make those decisions, elect representatives, and even voting on this Constitution. I mean, it was put in the Constitution to have constitutional amendments. So how appropriate for the rules of the election process in a high-level policy way that you, the people, have the opportunity to vote on this constitutional amendment. It's very, very appropriate, and I think it's a very fair way to start is by having it in the Constitution and following through, as we have done with other sections of the Minnesota State Constitution on election law, to continue that further in regards to more of the information that you as the voters would like to have. That is true now, and it will continue to be true as we go forward. It's very appropriate to have it in the Constitution.
Yeah, if I could add to that, the voter ID amendment does protect your right to vote. It protects all of our right to vote, because if there is voter fraud in the system, your right to speak and be heard in a government is taken away from you. It's stolen by people that commit acts of fraud on our election system. And as I said, there's no way that you can believe, you can't look at our election system with election day registration and vouching, understand the value of those ballots, and believe that no one would be tempted to steal it from you and disenfranchise your voice.
You know, I really take very strong exception to this, and I really do. Minnesota is looked upon nationally as the state for clean and open elections. We are the envy of this nation. These people have been painting a picture that is dark and getting darker by the minute. You would think that we have criminals hiding behind every single voter booth. We have women dressed up as men impersonating somebody else so they can vote. They have not come up with one single case of voter impersonation, not one. And then they come back here and tell us what a terrible system we have. We have a system that requires people to take an oath, to show identification where they live. If I came in with a photo passport under the Kiffmeyer bill, a United States passport with my photograph, that does not qualify.
That's incorrect.
That is correct. That they define what government-issued ID will be. It's not just any ID.
Governor, restrained from our format, if you'd like to conclude your comment, I'll ask the pro side to respond.
Jenna, excuse me. Actually, they had only taken a minute. With the anti-side had only taken a minute. They took their 2 minutes. Governor Carlson took another minute. So they're actually equal time.
Is it balanced?
It is.
Okay. And we were going to give 2 minutes to one side and then 2 minutes to the other. We can certainly go back and forth.
Whatever you want.
If it's all right with you folks.
No problem.
Okay. We don't want the rules to interfere with a good discussion. Okay. The next set of questions are directed to individual speakers. And the first question is for Representative Kiffmeyer. Can you explain more about how voter photo IDs and poll books will help to ensure more integrity at polling places?
Electronic poll books are not a new idea. Very similar to if you use your credit card or sometimes even your driver's license or state ID card and you swipe them through an electronic reader, and they're able to take the same information that is on the front of your ID card and be able to collect that information. So it is a concept that can be very helpful to speeding up the election process. It is not required by this constitutional amendment. However, it is something that the Ramsey County Director of Elections said. It's not a matter of if we get a tool like the electronic poll books, but that someday we will get them. It's just a matter of when, not if, because they will help speed things up, especially the laborious hand data entry that our larger counties spend a lot of time in. So it can be a very cost-effective tool for them instead of the hand data entry later on. However, it is not mandated, nor is it required by this constitutional amendment, so I just wanted to be clear in that regard.
And to follow up with that, thank you, Representative. Oh, I'm sorry. As an educational thing, Minnetonka has been experimenting with electronic poll books. Northern Iowa has been doing it. That's a different subject from photo ID.
Well, I just was going to follow up and say that it works well with the photo ID, those two together, and I'm sure we'll manage on our time and stuff too. But I thought an interesting point, though, was when we presented the possibility of using an electronic poll book, it was in the statutory bill, and I asked the Secretary of State office for a fiscal note. It was about $50 million, for that. And so the realization, though, is that when the Secretary of State himself had an electronic poll book concept that he had, his statement was that he could do that nearly for free and almost immediately. Two very broad-ranging things. My idea, $50 million, his idea, nearly free. I would suspect that this is one of those things that local units of government need to consider, whether this is cost-effective for them, but it is not a mandate.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Ms. Carolyn Jackson. Throughout the history of the U.S., various levels of government have enacted legal barriers to voting, and most of them have been struck down by the courts. How is this amendment any different, and do you think it would survive a constitutional challenge?
Wow. Well, I'm not on the United States Supreme Court, so I don't know the answer, but I can tell you something. One thing about putting it in the Constitution, and the proponents have been correct about this, by putting it in the Constitution, the Minnesota Supreme Court would not be able to protect us, because the most recent thing put in the Constitution is a ruling law. So you can't look at other parts of the Constitution and say, oh no, that is in conflict. They would have to be subsumed to the new language. Now, there's been one challenge in the United States Supreme Court, and that's the Indiana case, and that was a facial challenge. And so the challenge is, and I'm going to have to get into legalese on this a little bit, a facial challenge is by looking at the language of the statute, not any facts or any people, is that constitutional? And they looked at it and they said, yes, it is. And then there was a bill that was in Georgia that was on hold at that time, or a law, and because of the Indiana case, the Georgia law was allowed to stand. Now, currently, there is what is called an as-applied challenge in Wisconsin. And they've identified 14 people in Wisconsin, the ACLU has, who would not be able to vote because of Wisconsin's voter ID law. Now, their state Supreme Court has put their state law on hold because it's in the law and not the Constitution. So the ACLU's case, which is a federal case, or the federal United States Supreme Court, is on hold. But eventually, there will be an as-applied challenge that goes to the United States Supreme Court. And there will be real people who can't vote and will look at their specific fact situation and balance whether the burden put on them is justified by non-existent fraud that this is supposed to cover. So that's a legal explanation of where the voter ID law stands in the courts right now.
From the pro side.
Well, Ms. Jackson is exactly correct. That the Minnesota Supreme Court wouldn't be able to do anything to affect the voter ID amendment if it's adopted by we the people. That's going to be the law of the land, period. It could potentially and probably will be challenged in a federal court, but we're talking about the people that are unable to get identification, unable to vote because of a voter ID law. We've heard these kind of claims before. In the Georgia case, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, NAACP brought people forth to the judge that claimed they would be unable to vote because of the voter ID requirement. When the judge started asking them questions, well, did you know you could get identification for free under this law? Did you know that they've got assistance for people getting identification? And they'd say, oh, well, no, I didn't realize I could do that. Did you know that you could use this particular kind of ID to vote? Oh, I didn't realize that. And what ended up happening is that every person that was brought forth that they claimed to be unable to vote, turned out they could have. They just didn't know how to go about getting the identification. So education is going to be a critical part of enacting the voter ID amendment. And the legislature is planning to spend, as the Supreme Court mandates, millions of dollars on a voter education campaign. There is no one in the state of Minnesota who is legitimate who will be unable to get identification and vote under this amendment.
Okay, thank you. Next question for Mr. McGrath. In regard to the claim Minnesota leads the nation in the number of voter fraud, how would Minnesota rank with other states in looking at the rate of percentage of votes cast that were illegal?
Can you repeat that question?
I'm reading the question as written. I think if I were to interpret it a bit here, in regard to the claim Minnesota leads the nation in the number of voter fraud, how would Minnesota rank with other states with regard to voter fraud?
Well, I haven't analyzed it on a percentage basis, and I haven't created a top 10 list of voter fraud states. What I do know is that prior to the 2008 election, the highest number of recorded convictions of voter fraud from a single election happened in Jackson County, Missouri in 1936. There were 256 cases. Since that time, no one has achieved anywhere close to the 200 numbers that we've seen in Minnesota. That is, by the way, just the tip of the iceberg. Our independent research is what caught this, not our system. The system failed to catch it. It required Minnesota Majority's research and twisting some arms of county attorneys to prosecute. 1,099 total ineligible felons are proven to have voted while ineligible in the 2008 election. 6,224 voters are flagged for challenge right now in the voter registration system because they provided names or addresses that didn't check out. This information isn't just made up out of thin air. It was provided by the Secretary of State's office. It's in the statewide voter registration system. It's available to anybody that wants to ask for it and pay the fee for getting the disc from the office.
All right, we're making up numbers now. The number that is out there is 200 people. 200 people were convicted of voting while they were on parole or probation. That's less than 0.05% of the votes cast in 2008. All right, any engineer would kill for that level of accuracy, 99.9995% accurate. And the reason that these people were able to vote, first of all, they're free, they're on probation and parole. There is no database that lists every person who's continuing to serve a felony sentence in Minnesota that is on probation or parole. The way it works is when you are on probation, and you're out, you can meet with your probation officer, and they meet fairly regularly. But then if your life goes on pretty well, the probation officer says, go on, only meet with me if you need to, if you get into trouble. So they don't have their address, they don't know where they are, and that person very likely thinks that they're free. They're done, they don't have to meet with a probation officer anymore. There are only 200 of those people who are convicted, and convictions are the only number that matter.
I'm sorry, not making up numbers, but 1,099 is the total number of people that voted while ineligible. The 200 that were convicted were either proven to have voted while ineligible, knowing that they were ineligible to vote because this is standard for conviction, or they admitted that they knew they were ineligible to vote. The other ones largely got off without prosecution because they claimed that they did not know they were ineligible to vote, or the statute of limitations expired before they could prosecute. And as I said, these are people that knew they were ineligible to vote, did so anyway. The 200 convictions is just the tip of the iceberg.
If I may, we keep talking about these felons, and there is a problem with felons who are not entitled to vote actually voting. There's no question about it. The numbers aren't quite as high as the other side would have, but that's not the point. The point is that this amendment does not address that problem. That's the dilemma. This problem did come up in the legislative session of 2010. A bill was passed and vetoed by the governor, and he said it wasn't sufficiently partisan. I have no problem with that. But the point is, the subject was up. Mary Kiffmeyer did come up to correct the problem. Dan McGrath and his moral majority or whatever didn't come up to correct the problem.
Please.
Whatever the group is, I'm serious. I don't know the name of the group. But aside from that, they didn't correct the problem where they had an opportunity. Now they're coming in with voter impersonation law when we have no voter impersonation. So we're giving a patient medicine for an illness that they do not have. So I would prefer, if we're going to discuss this amendment, that we discuss why it is here and what offenses have occurred that bring it here.
This amendment does require eligibility verification for all voters, whether they're advanced registrants or people in the polling place. Ineligible felons, wards of the state that have lost their right to vote, and non-citizens that are known to the state will all be prevented from voting under this amendment.
That is not correct because we don't have the database to cross file.
Do we use it?
No, we do not. And if we would open the door to the database, we also open the door to the costs that are involved. And Mary Kiffmeyer made it abundantly clear that was a door she didn't want to have open. But if you want to open it, I'll be happy to have another debate with you on that subject.
And last word from the pro side?
Representative Kiffmeyer, as Secretary of State for 8 years, you might want to describe the databases that are used to verify eligibility of voters.
Absolutely. The current state voter registration system is a very powerful system. It was developed in-house by union employees in the Secretary of State office with also the help of other contractors that were hired. But it is our own employees, our own Minnesota people that designed the system and did a very good job. And so those systems work together with the Department of Public Safety. They receive data from the Social Security office. They receive data from a variety of others, from the courts. And so this kind of opportunity here to interact with them, things that are already going on that are done before Election Day for those who pre-register. And so these things are available to us. They are there. They are being used currently. And so, and certainly not only that, as we go further more and more with our technology, this gets even easier. And as the Director of Elections in our 2 larger counties, it's just a matter of time to have more kinds of technology because it will save them labor costs. It will enable them to comply with the Help America Vote Act, which requires immediate entry of voter registration information, which now is taking up to somewhere around 3 to 6 months. So I think technology, we're not back in the Hicks here. We are doing quite well and quite capable of doing many of these things in the future as well with our state government employees and with other tools that are available to us. This is not the Hicks. We are Minnesota, and we can do this.
Governor?
Oh, thank you. If we had this database, then it raises interesting questions. Why are all these felons voting? Apparently it's not working very well. I'll tell you the reason is the databases are all in silos. When we tried to put together the database for the tobacco lawsuit that you'll recall, it involved several 100,000. And it took us over a year at a cost of over $8 million. And that is just a fraction of what a database would look like when you have 3 million voters and you have many, many more silos that you've got to break into and create an integrated system. That becomes expensive. So on one hand, Mary Kiffmeyer is telling us we have a superb system, but she has to acknowledge if all these numbers that they say are true, it certainly isn't working very well. And the photo ID is not going to solve that problem, because since you can't cross-fertilize, you don't know whether or not that individual is or is not eligible as a former felon. Therein lies your problem.
So,
Senator Kiffmeyer.
Yes, thank you. To rebut to that, silos are old. That's old stuff in the silos. I've served in the legislature for the last 4 years, State Government Finance Committee, heard much discussion, worked with Representative Keith Downey on these things and the state IT director. That's just, I know that things in the past maybe were different, but things are different today, and our capacities to do that. But the biggest thing is that we are doing it today for those who are pre-registered. We're just not taking advantage of that and using that for those who register to vote on Election Day. And so you have unequal treatment of your voters. Those who pre-registered go through this, nothing to do with silos. It has to do with systems that are in place right now. And then you have the people who come to register to vote on Election Day are not subject to those same kinds of things that are taken care of for those who pre-register. We just want equal treatment for all eligible voters. These are simple tools. They don't even have to have technology. What we had was a real oldish kind of technology. It's called paper list that we had in our statutory bill, so that smaller townships or other areas where it was cost effective can use a simple alphabetical paper list called a challenge list. This is not something hugely complicated or difficult. We just need to make use of the technology and tools that are there for us today.
if I may, I've been attending, the governor has a task force on election integrity that's been meeting for the last 2 years to look specifically at the problem of felons voting. And the first thing we did, we had the Minnesota courts, the Minnesota corrections, the county association, the city association, sit down and talk about what the state is. So we're conflating a bunch of things here when we're talking about databases. When we're talking specifically about felons, the shocking realization was there is no single database that tells people who are currently ineligible to vote because of a felony conviction. That particular database does not exist right now. And it would be very expensive, and you'd have to do a lot of work to put that together. But right now, that particular database does not exist. Now, the statewide voter registration system that Representative Kiffmeyer talked about is a wonderful system. It's one of the jewels that makes us the best state for voting in the United States. So we have a list of voters right now. There are people out here who are not registered. Okay, this list is run against a number of different databases. And that's what we're talking about, silos. Maybe they can talk to each other, but they're run separately. They're run against the driver's license database. They're run against the Department of Health database to see if you're alive. They're run against the Social Security Administration database to see if you're alive. They're run against the Postal Service to see if you've moved. And there are several others. But it's run against all these things. There's no unified database of people, of that type of data that comes from different agencies that lists all the eligibility factors. That is where we're talking about silos. Those would have to all be put together and created and accessible by the voting place for substantially equivalent eligibility verification at the time of voting. When you register to vote on election day, your information is then afterwards run against these databases. And if there's a problem, it's investigated and then it's a felony violation if you've lied about that. So election day registrants are run against the same checks, only they're subjected to a higher penalty if they've gotten it wrong. Then if you do it beforehand, it's checked before election and it's flagged as a challenge. Afterwards, it's flagged as a potential felony.
Okay, just want to ask timekeepers if we're okay. Okay, thank you. The last directed question will go to Governor Carlson. Why do you think the bill enacting the legislation for this amendment was passed on straight party lines? Why do Republicans and Democrats see this issue so polarized?
Well, I would hesitate to suggest that there's any political mischief in the state legislature. Let me answer it this way, if I may. We are a polarized society, and sadly both parties have a very difficult time working with each other. And I think part of the process is the caucus system, which encourages extremism, discourages the broad middle. But part of it also is this holier-than-thou attitude, that somehow some people are able to talk to a higher power and the rest of us aren't. And therefore we have certain rights to impose upon you. And I find that very bothersome. This democracy was founded on the notion that every citizen, not most, not some, not a majority, but every citizen has a right to vote. And the only ones that are disqualified are the mentally ill, incompetent, and under guardianship, felons, etc. But all the rest of us have a right to vote. And there's a clear understanding that we have a right to equal access. And it's not unusual for political parties, Democrat or Republican, to abuse the power of being in the majority and to put together legislation that will make it difficult for the other side to get their voters to the troops. I was very suspicious as a legislator of same-day registration, extremely suspicious. History has proven me wrong. I'm delighted. But it was as a result of that, it expanded voter participation. And that's what makes Minnesota so very, very unique. And our system is a clean system, it's a good system, and it's a system that should always encourage participation and should never allow political mischief to be written into the to the Minnesota Constitution.
And from the girls' side.
I think that we'll probably share this a little bit, but I thought it was interesting in taking a look at some previous veto letters that the governor issued to election laws and some of his comments. And one of the reasons why I've admired Governor Carlson in the past because of some of those activities. But, you know, one of the things he says, that it was an individual societal obligation to take the initiative to re-register when there was a law that would have done it automatically. He said, no. Individual has a societal obligation to take the initiative. Governor also said that finally democracy is not supposed to be easy. We have a duty not to cheapen what our forebears dreamed of and fought for. And so there is without question, and maybe even possibly in the future, Governor, as you may have thought, same day, which by the way was passed on a partisan vote, but that maybe think different. Maybe you'll change your mind in the future also when the photo ID constitutional amendment passes, and some years down the road you will find that some of the fears and some of those things that are going on have not come to pass either. Certainly for us, when we take a look at this, I just want to make sure that I give you a minute, Dan, to address this issue, if you like.
Among the general public, voter ID is not a partisan issue. When the 21st Century Voter ID bill that Representative Kiffmeyer authored in 2011 was being debated in the legislature, the Star Tribune poll at that time showed that it had 80% public support. You don't get to 80% support in any state, I don't think, certainly not Minnesota with just one political party. It was a majority of every political stripe in support of that bill, but it was still, the will of the people was thwarted by Governor Dayton in that respect. So it's not a partisan thing. It is among certain members of the political class, but among the rank and file, it's just a common sense thing. It's not a Democrat or Republican issue, it's a fairness issue.
This is not about photo ID. This is about amending the Constitution of Minnesota. This is about a radical rewrite of how we run elections in this state. It will dramatically change election day registration. And there's no way it can be run exactly the way it is now under this constitutional amendment. There is no way you can have substantially equivalent eligibility verifications given the tools we have right now without one of two things happening. One is you can end election day registration. Not a problem then. It's the easiest, cheapest thing to do in response to this constitutional amendment. The other option is that everybody who votes on election day casts a provisional ballot. 500,000 people registered to vote on election day in 2008. There will be 500,000 provisional ballots. We don't know how it's going to work. No state in the union has both election day registration and provisional ballots. And then, if for somehow or other, by magic, all of these things, the health department, the driver's license data, court data, the Social Security Administration, the post office can all be consolidated by July 1st, 2013. Then you can have a system where you take a magic card, and maybe it's your driver's license, and you can swipe it, and you can access all those different databases at one time. Now, in rural Minnesota, that's an impossibility because they don't have high-speed internet access. So magically, by July 1st, 2013, we're going to institute high-speed internet access to Greater Minnesota. That would be wonderful. We don't have money, we don't have the capacity to do that, but that would be wonderful. It would bring the 21st century to the farthest reaches of our state. I would love that. But it's very expensive, and it can't be done by July 1st of next year. So instead, they're going to get paper. So one of the databases that we run against is the death records from the Department of Health. You have to have the list of everybody who's ever died in Minnesota at every single precinct. How are you going to have that many pages to rifle through? Is Carolyn Jackson still alive? Let's see, here's the J's. Let's see, how many people named Jackson have died since records were beginning to keep in Minnesota? Is she still really alive? This is ridiculous. So that's not an option. There's one of two things. Ends election day registration or provisional ballots for every election day registrant.
This question started on the no side, so the vote yes side should have the final word.
What's being suggested here about forcing all voters, if they're registering on election day, to use provisional ballots is not supported by the language of the amendment. It doesn't say that. It's very specific that people who don't have ID will cast provisional ballots. The amendment doesn't contemplate that identity and eligibility won't be able to establish on the spot in the polling place. You don't need to run against the history of everyone that's ever died to establish someone's eligibility. That's hyperbole. It's ridiculous.
Okay, we've got time for one more question, and it goes to the panel. This response should start on the pro side. Are efforts to control voter fraud likely to result in voter suppression?
No, that hasn't been the situation in any other state that's enacted voter ID. Certainly not the intent of the amendment. What's going to happen here is that people who are on the margins of society that are having a difficult time getting around in life are going to suddenly find it's a little bit easier to get around in life because the state's going to make identification available at no charge. Identification that they can use to rent an apartment, to get a job, to open a bank account, to integrate into society in ways that they're unable to because of the lack of identification. The only voting that will be suppressed by this amendment is illegal voting.
Okay. When voter ID was passed in the state of Pennsylvania, the Republican Speaker of the Pennsylvania House said, "We just guaranteed this state will go for Mitt Romney." That's a fact. That's because, and the state has been polling very much to not go for Mitt Romney. It's close. It's a toss-up state. But he said we'll be able to suppress enough votes that we can give this state to Mitt Romney. That's what he said. Now, whether that's true or not, I can't verify that, but that's the fact that he stated that. And I want to go back to provisional ballots very quickly. It's not hyperbole. When my registration is run, it is run against a database of who's dead in the state of Minnesota. Okay? The Department of Health death records. And that's everybody who's died in the state of Minnesota. And that is one of the databases that checks my eligibility to vote. And it checks the eligibility votes. That's a fact.
With identification in hand, you don't need to confirm that someone is alive. That's to prevent identity fraud. The identification proves that you are who you say you are. The fact that you're standing there proves that you're breathing. So that check isn't going to be necessary. And as far as this Pennsylvania Republican, he did not say that. That is not the quote. He didn't talk about suppressing votes. I've heard the quote. What he was implying is he believes there's enough voter fraud in that state to swing close elections, and the party doesn't get a fair shake.
Oh, the interpretation, the spin.
We may not be able to fact check that one tonight. Okay, before we go to closing comments, I'd like to introduce Gary Greffenberg. And Gary is the chair of the Roseville Human Rights Commission. And Gary has just a couple of comments that he'd like to address to the audience.
The reason the Roseville Human Rights Commission wanted to co-sponsor with Maplewood, this commission, is that the right to vote is a fundamental human right. It falls under the subspecies of civil rights. So as such, civil law can regulate how this right is exercised. So we feel, as the Human Rights Commission, the more information we provide, the more intelligent choice you can make on this highly controversial issue. I'm from the range, so people can usually hear me. Can you all hear me?
Gary,
the people outside.
The microphone at the podium. Well,
There you go.
we've got a handheld there.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The only other thing I wanted to mention, there will be further forums on this issue. And if you'd like more information, please give us, if you'd like to be alerted to these additional human rights forums, please sign in here and we'll make sure you get a copy of the information. The signing is not required, but if you'd like more information on this issue and other issues, such as another product of the Minnesota Republican majority, which is the Gay Marriage Amendment. In 2 weeks from now, we'll be co-sponsoring a forum on that amendment, which also was highly partisan. And we'd like to provide you with an opportunity to ask questions. In 2 weeks at the community center, we'll be co-sponsoring that. And again, if you'd like more information on this human rights issue, please give us your name and address. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Okay, we are ready for our closing comments. And the case for vote yes presented by the pro-amendment folks.
I want to say thank you again to the Human Rights Commissions that have worked together today to be able to have this opportunity. I appreciate your efforts and your work. Thank you to Maplewood again. In regards to this constitutional amendment and its value of being discussed so much amongst the people and their support and their opposition being fairly debated, it is important to recognize, I thought I'd read just a few more quotes from, in this case, from another court. The absence of prosecutions is explained by the endemic under-enforcement of minor criminal laws, minor as they appear to the public and prosecutors at all events, and by the extreme difficulty of apprehending a voter impersonator. I think it's important to recognize that the courts have seen the tremendous difficulty and that without an ID, how do you know? In another court, fraudulent voting effectively dilutes the votes of lawful voters. By instituting requirements to guard against the abuse of the elective franchise, a state protects the right of lawful voters to exercise their full share of this franchise. In order to protect that compelling interest, a state may enact generally applicable and even-handed restrictions that protect the integrity and reliability of the electoral process. So I think that the realization here is the courts have spoken to two very important things: the question of the voter impersonation and the difficulty in catching, and the importance of having a photo ID so you can deter it or detect it. And the most important thing is prevent it. We've come into a society, I'm a nurse. We do prevention. We don't pat ourselves on the back at all, in only a sense that if we haven't prevented it, we'll take care of you. But if at all possible, we want to prevent. Why do we have to have an election system that's based upon catch and prosecute? And meantime, the ballot is cast and counted and disenfranchise somebody else. Why do we have to do that? When something like a photo ID can be used and deter, detect, and give greater public confidence to the voting process. What's radical is some of the interpretations and the numbers and the statements. I mean, it's just like they've taken the most extreme way of restricting things by their own interpretation, not by anything that this constitutional amendment has in and of itself, the language that it has. Without an ID, how do we know you are who you say you are? How do you know? About 2.3 million pre-registered voters coming into the polling place and we have no assurance that the voter entitled to the ballot is actually the one voting. You can go through all that checking databases and the things you want to do ahead of time. That's not the issue. That is one of them, and equal treatment of those who pre-register and those who register on election day before the ballot is cast, not after. But when you come into the polling place on election day, such as a gentleman has said to me, my mother moved to Wisconsin, but I had her mail forwarded to my address so I could help take care of things for her. Much to my surprise, her voter registration was changed to his address, and she doesn't live with me. And he had his concerns. From the 2008 election, from the Secretary of State office itself, there are challenged 6,224 voters. Those are real, not made up from the Secretary of State office. There were 23,000, but the county officials and local officials checked, they looked, but there's still 6,224. Add to that about 1,100 felons who should have been kept out but weren't. The difference in that election for the top office in the state was 312. It should be decided by eligible voters entitled to vote, not those who aren't. Minnesota spends money to catch and prosecute after the election. We spend money on counting. We spend money on recounting. And currently, local election officials already work together with the Secretary of State office to conduct elections. The measure of a good election system is hardly measured by counting or recounting ballots that never should have been there to begin with. Just because we have the end of the system down is not the measure to use. The entire system should be conducted with integrity, from registration, casting a ballot, to a recount. It is also being sure that eligible voters are not disenfranchised by the dishonest. To think that liars, cheaters, and stealers exist all around us, but somehow only angels come to vote, is naive and lacks common sense. The photo ID amendment will keep it easy to vote, but hard to cheat. Thank you.
Okay, and the case for vote no from the anti-side.
I'm going to start by reading the language. Excuse me. I'm going to start by reading the language of the amendment, and then let the governor close. All voters voting in person must present a valid government-issued photographic identification before receiving a ballot. The state must issue photographic identification at no charge to an eligible voter who does not have a form of identification meeting the requirements of this section. A voter unable to present government-issued photographic identification must be permitted to submit a provisional ballot. A provisional ballot must only be counted if the voter certifies the provisional ballot in the manner provided by law. All voters, including those not voting in person, must be subject to substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification prior to a ballot being cast or counted. And this will be effective July 1st, 2013. Governor?
Just you.
Oh, it was just me. Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you very much for your attendance. Democracy does, to a large extent, belong to those who show up, and I think it's important that we have these kinds of forums. Frankly, I would love to have a whole set of debates with the people on my right around the state. I mean that most sincerely, because this is a very important amendment. What we're basically doing is scrapping the system that we currently have, which I think it's fair to say most observers will say that Minnesota has the finest voting system in America. We have the highest turnouts. I don't know where these numbers that they float come from, but I do know there's a vast difference between an allegation or a suspicion and a conviction. Mike Freeman could not find, in his survey of all the problems they had in Hennepin County, could not find one case of voter impersonation. The people to my right have not been able all night to come up with one single case. But yet they say that somehow Minnesota is fraught with election fraud. If it is, it certainly has escaped my attention. And for 4 years, it escaped the attention of Mary Kiffmeyer as Secretary of State, because she never brought a bill in to put an end to this system either. And in 2010, when the felony subject was up, and that's the subject that they keep criticizing, when that subject came up, she voted no on the bill, and I'm comfortable with that. I can understand that. But why didn't she bring in her own bill? Why didn't she amend the bill? Why didn't she and the governor work together and figure out how they could improve this problem? Why didn't they create a bipartisan commission and look into these terrible things that they're telling us existed? They didn't just start yesterday. They must have been going on before. But in the 2008 election, when every single ballot was counted, the Republican attorneys said there was no fraud. We couldn't find it. In 2010, when we had a close gubernatorial election, the Republican candidate went through ballot after ballot after ballot and finally gave up and said, I couldn't find any. Now, somehow they found a lot. But even if that were true, then you should have a study, find out how serious the problem is, and what is the proper remedy, and what is the cost. The remedy they have come up with is for an illness that we do not have. It's about voter impersonation. If they want to deal with the problem of felons improperly voting, that's a separate subject. Voter impersonation and having a voter ID will not put an end to that problem. The burden has to be, when you amend the Constitution, to recognize that that may be in there for a very, very long time. You can't just flippantly undo it at the next legislative session. You can't say, whoops, we made a mistake. The first elections in 2013 will be in Minneapolis. There is no way whatsoever that this amendment, if passed, should be implemented in time for that election. And that means it will have to go to the Supreme Court and somehow get relief. The ultimate solution is going to be, one, think about this. Have Democrats and Republicans been able to resolve a budget difference without special session? Do you honestly think that Dayton and Mary Kiffmeyer are going to agree in the next session on voter ID? And do it by July, which is when this gets enacted? It is going to be extraordinarily expensive, and even if agreed upon, it's going to courts, and you and I are going to pay the bill. But again, I thank you very much for your participation. I sincerely thank all of the panelists. I very much appreciate this evening.
I'd like to ask the speakers if they can stick around for a few minutes. A number of media people have asked if they could have some time with you after the debate tonight. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their spirited participation in the forum tonight. Thanks to the City of Maplewood staff and all the commissioners of the Maplewood and Roseville Human Rights Commissions for helping to sponsor this event. And would like to say to all of those who attended the forum this evening that we really appreciate your respectful participation. We hope that we will see you at the Marriage Amendment Forum 2 weeks from tonight at the Maplewood Community Center. Thank you and good night. Thank you.